Okay, let's get into it. For the last, week? We have been just drowning ourselves in everything we could find on Zach Cregger's 2025 film, Weapons.
Drowning is the right word.
Yeah.
Critical analyses, script excerpts, some really dense academic reports.
And it's a movie that has, by every metric you look at the box office, it's past $269 million globally. It has absolutely captured and I think haunted the zeitgeist.
It really has. And, for today's deep dive, we're not just reviewing a film. We're really trying to excavate a crime scene of cinematic intent.
The crime scene, I like that.
Yeah, because if Barbarian, his last film, was sort of a blunt instrument, this is different. The sources we read kept calling it a precision scalpel.
Right.
A scalpel that's just meticulously dissecting what one paper called the necrotic tissue of the American social contract.
So our mission today is to go way beyond the surface level scares, right?
Okay.
Because on the surface, it's a supernatural horror movie.
It is.
Yeah.
But we want to decode the allegorical density. This is really for you if you've seen the film and you're left with that deeply unsettling feeling that there's something more going on just beneath the surface.
And there is. The core thesis, the real monster in the town of Maybrook isn't the witch. It's what all the analysis points to as societal paralysis.
But hang on, before we jump into the big visuals, let me just push back on that for a second.
Okay.
If the film spends so much time building up this very literal, very real witch on Gladys, how can the true monster be something as abstract as societal paralysis? Isn't that, kind of a mixed metaphor?
That's a really fair question. But the sources are pretty definitive. The witch, Gladys, she functions as both an accelerant.
Accelerant.
Yeah, and the consequence of the structural problem. She's the mythological evil that comes in and just exploits a social condition that was already there, festering.
So the horror isn't that she can take the children. Exactly. The horror is the community's immediate, collective inability to process that trauma without turning on each other. They immediately weaponize their own grief and suspicion, and that creates the perfect, quiet, undisturbed environment for the real evil to just do its work.
So the community's internal rot, their paralysis, is what opens the door for the external evil to walk right in.
That's the one. That descent into a witch hunt, which is both, literal against Gladys, but also metaphorical against the teacher, Justine. Right. That's the central action of the movie.
Okay, so to really get that, we need to break down three things. First, the narrative structure, that Rashomon-style thing.
Yep, which we'll get into. It traps every character in their own little silo. Then, the semiotics, the meaning behind the surreal images.
And finally, failed masculinity. Josh Brolin's character, Archer Graff.
It's a full frame-by-frame deconstruction.
Then let's start with the image. The one that's on all the posters, the one that defines the entire movie. The floating AR-15. This is Cregger's thesis statement right from the opening shot.
It is the definitive, haunting image of 2025 cinema, hands down. And let's just take a minute to visualize it for you, because the way it's shot is so important.
Yeah, let's slow down here.
You have this opening shot, and it comes back again and again. It's not just a big gun. It's colossal.
Yeah.
It's a massive, modern AR-15 assault rifle, matte black, and it's just hovering silently, impossibly.
Over this pristine, quiet, suburban landscape. And that contrast is everything.
Everything.
You see these perfectly manicured lawns, the cheerful primary colors of the houses, a kid's bike just left on a driveway, total mundane domesticity. And then you tilt up, and hanging in this pale, overcast sky is this stark, dark beacon.
It casts this immense shadow, not just a literal shadow, but you feel its weight. A palpable shadow over everything. Feels like something from a shared national nightmare or a collective fever dream.
And the power of it, I think, comes from a very deliberate choice he made.
Okay.
He's never fired.
Never. It's completely still. It doesn't move. It doesn't tilt. It doesn't threaten in an active way. Its terror comes entirely from its sheer, undeniable presence.
The source material had a great description for it. It called it a dark, metallic shape hanging over the town like a storm cloud.
A storm cloud. It's an object of potential energy, not kinetic action. And Cregger plays with the sensory experience, too.
The sound design. Let's talk about the sound design in these scenes.
It's brilliant. Because you're seeing this impossible, terrifying object, but what you're hearing is just normal suburban sounds.
The whir of a lawnmower, a dog barking way off in the distance, the chatter of a sprinkler system.
But underneath all of it, there's this deep, low-frequency hum. It's almost subliminal, a sonic presence that just tells you on a gut level that something is profoundly structurally wrong here.
The gun doesn't need to fire to be a menace. Its existence alone suggests that the potential for catastrophic violence is the new, terrifying baseline for American life.
It is the weather. That's the best way to put it. It's the visual and sonic representation of atmospheric anxiety.
Yeah.
The characters wake up, they make coffee, they go to school, and they do it all under the constant pressure of this inescapable threat. It's always there.
So that brings me back to the question, why make it float? Why not have it fired in some hyper-violent, spectacular way? Why rob the audience of that, that cathartic violence?
Because catharsis is the very thing the film wants to deny you.
Ah.
If the AR-15 was fired, if it was part of a specific horrible event, then the town could process it. They could mourn it. They could rally against the event.
It would have a beginning and an end.
Exactly. By making it just present, Cregger symbolizes unending potentiality. It's the sword of Damocles hanging over the entire community and that paralyzing fear of what could happen at any moment. That is the engine of the societal paralysis.
Okay, so the floating weapon is a misdirection, almost. It keeps their subconscious minds focused on this huge sociological problem, the ubiquity of gun violence. And it blinds them to the much more immediate, mythic violence of the witch operating just a few blocks away.
Precisely. They're so busy living under the shadow of the floating gun that they miss the actual monster eating away at the foundations of their town. And the moment you realize the gun isn't a supernatural curse, but a sociological one, the whole film it shifts.
It stops being about a witch.
And it starts being about how we, as a society, are now culturally conditioned to process the loss of children through this one terrifying modern lens of potential mass tragedy.
That structural shift is so key, and it's built right into the film's architecture. We have to talk about how Cregger put this story together. He completely throws out the traditional three-act structure.
Gun. Instead, he gives us this chapter-based story. Each chapter named for a character: Justine, Archer, Paul, and so on.
It's not really a plot. The sources called it a relay race of trauma.
A great way to put it. The baton of the narrative gets passed from one subjective experience to the next. And this is where everyone brings up the film Rashomon, but that comparison is, it's useful, but it's also a little misleading.
How so? What's the distinction between what Kurosawa was doing in Rashomon and what Cregger's doing here?
In Rashomon, the whole point is the unreliability of memory. Different characters remember the same event differently to, protect their ego or their social standing.
Right. It's about subjective truth.
But in Weapons, it's about the isolation of experience. This is a crucial distinction. The characters aren't just remembering one event differently. They are literally living in different genres of film.
Wow. Okay, break that down. Give us an example.
The big one is the handoff from Justine Gandy's chapter to Archer Graff's. For Justine, the teacher, she's living in a pure psychological horror movie, a paranoia thriller.
She's the scapegoat. She's being watched. She's getting these silent, condemning looks from everyone. She's being hunted by her own community.
Exactly. And then snap. The narrative baton is passed to Archer Graff, Josh Brolin's character. Suddenly, we're in a dark revenge thriller.
Or domestic drama.
Yeah, crossed with a domestic drama. He is the aggressor, he's consumed by rage, and his entire focus is on finding a concrete, tangible target for that rage.
They're on completely different planets. They can't communicate. Justine can't explain her growing, bizarre paranoia to Archer because his reality, his genre, demands a villain he can punch.
Yes, his mind cannot process an ambiguous, mythological evil, so it latches on to the most convenient, concrete, proximate target it can find: the teacher.
And so the very structure of the film reinforces its main theme. Trauma isolates us, and that isolation is what allows the real monster to succeed.
That is the definition of societal paralysis, a complete breakdown of collective action born from this structural isolation.
It's just so brilliantly constructed, but the film isn't just critiquing psychology, it gets into actual legislation. We have to dive deep into this, the infamous 2.17 code.
This is a stunning piece of embedded political critique.
Yeah.
Just hiding there in plain sight.
So the children all disappear at 2:17 a.m.
Yep. And later in these nightmare sequences, if you look very closely at that floating AR-15, you see glowing digital numbers projected onto its casing. 217.
Which at first just feels like a spooky witching hour trope.
But it is so much more specific than that. The sources we found uncovered the direct reference.
And the fact is, what does this have to do with H.R. 1808?
H.R. 1808 was the assault weapons ban of 2022, a real piece of legislation. And that bill passed the U.S. House of Representatives
With exactly 217 votes.
exactly 217 votes.
Wow, I mean, that just elevates it from a simple horror number to this explicit, deeply cynical memorial to legislative failure. So why that specific bill from 2022? What's the statement Cregger's making there?
It marks the moment of institutional defeat. That bill passing the House with 217 votes gave so much hope to advocates, to grieving families, only for it to die. It just stalled out in the Senate, never even got a vote.
So Cregger is embedding that specific political failure right into the DNA of the horror. 2.17 isn't a time of day, it's a vote count. It's a marker of the exact point where the system failed to act.
And the film is saying that moment, that failure,
Yeah.
that's when the children are taken. That's the moment the American system failed to protect its most vulnerable. And as a direct result, the structural violence, that floating AR-15, that perpetual storm cloud, it remained undisturbed.
At the core message. It ties the abstract violence of political inaction directly to the visceral, mythic violence of the witch, which is why the whole movie feels so real, even with the supernatural plot.
It mirrors our trauma. The film processes this supernatural loss using the only emotional vocabulary America seems to have left for mass catastrophe.
The language of mass tragedy.
Exactly. And the details confirm it. Why 17 children?
It's a direct echo of the death toll at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland. Cregger is deliberately forcing the audience to access those specific, recent, unbearable feelings of loss.
And the town's reaction is a perfect mirror. The frantic parents, the police tape, the media circus.
The desperate need to find a human scapegoat right away, like the teacher, Justine.
It mimics the aftermath of events like Sandy Hook or Uvalde perfectly. Archer Graff dreams of the colossal floating gun because his psyche is trying to process a loss that feels like a school shooting even though it was a magical spell.
The profound point being that in modern America, maybe we only have one primary devastating cultural tragedy now. And so we process all catastrophic loss of children through that one terrible language.
A witch takes them, and the town defaults to the emotional and institutional response of a mass tragedy caused by a gun.
Which leads us directly into the consequence of that response, the witch hunt. You called the narrative structure a sweat-inducing relay race. That snap from Justine's perspective to Archer's. It forces us into a really uncomfortable complicity.
Yeah, you're forced to understand the mechanics of the mob from the inside out. We see Archer's grief. It's raw. It's visceral. His loss is completely understandable. But then you watch that grief calcify almost instantly into a rage that actively sabotages the investigation and just destroys Justine's life.
And that's the core heartbreaking irony of the movie. The town is right. They know an ancient evil is at work. They just picked the wrong target.
Completely wrong. All their rage, all their surveillance, all their resources get focused on Justine Gandy, the scapegoat. And why her?
Because she's the easy target. She's young, she's an outsider to some degree, and she represents the secular authority, the school that parents feel has failed them.
She's the convenient modern punching bag. The town would much rather believe a teacher is negligent or even evil than accept the terrifying powerlessness that comes with a threat they can't understand or fight.
You see it play out like a modern-day Salem. The whispers, the cold shoulders, then someone paints the word witch on her car.
And all the while, the true monster, Aunt Gladys, is practically invisible. She's this elderly, seemingly frail woman in a decaying house on the edge of town. The sources call her the embodiment of ancestral rot.
Ancestral rot.
Or traditional decay. She's protected by her anonymity, by the fact that she's part of the old town that everyone is just comfortable ignoring. The town attacks the modern institution, the school, rather than dealing with the rot in the old house.
And the consequence of that paralysis is just strategically disastrous. It's devastating. While Archer is using military terms and setting up surveillance on Justine's house, his own son is being drained of life in a basement a few blocks away.
The energy spent on the witch hunt is what allows the real witch to succeed. The mob mentality isn't just morally wrong, it costs time. It costs lives.
Which brings us to this idea of frozen grief. Why are the parents, and especially Archer, stuck in that anger stage?
Because Archer Graff's whole identity, his whole conception of masculinity, demands a target. He's a man of action. Ambiguity is a threat to who he is. He can't accept a supernatural disappearance.
Right. There's no body to bury, no enemy to fight.
So his grief has nowhere to go. It just freezes. It freezes and becomes a weapon. And he becomes a danger to the very immunity he thinks he's protecting because his rage is just lashing out, looking for anything to hit.
His reaction isn't mourning, it's militarizing.
Yes. And that frames his masculinity not as a source of strength, but as a catastrophic vulnerability, which of course sets up the biggest conflict in the film and the debate for us today. The crisis of masculinity embodied by Archer.
Let's start with the casting. It's not an accident that it's Josh Brolin.
Not at all. I mean, think of his roles. Thanos, Cable, Sicario. He's the archetype of the capable, rugged, unflappable protector. Cregger casts him specifically to deconstruct that very image.
Because Archer's entire toolkit, his physical strength, his aggression, his intimidation, is completely and totally useless here.
You can't punch a ghost. You can't interrogate a spell. He's a man of action in a situation that requires emotional processing and community trust, and his entire system it short circuits. It fails.
Okay, let's get into the debate. Because the sources really force you to feel conflicted about him. I want to take the position of sympathy for Archer, the grieving father. I don't see his attack on Justine as cold malice. I see it as a pure panic response. It's driven by his absolute terrifying impotence.
And I'm going to argue aggressively that that exact panic response, when it's channeled into aggression, is the essence of the toxic masculinity the film is critiquing. It makes him a villain of structure, even if he's not a villain of intent.
I just see him as this deeply tragic figure. He's a builder, a man who solves problems with force, with his hands. And when his son vanishes, that whole way of being becomes useless. So his masculinity, the way culture taught him to be a man, becomes a defensive coping mechanism. It demands he find an enemy to fight, because the alternative,
Which is?
admitting he's powerless, just sitting in that profound, directionless sorrow that's culturally unacceptable for a guy like him. The analysis said he was sickened by his own helplessness. That rage is just calcified grief with nowhere to go. He's an accidental monster.
But I have to push back on that. That inability to process internal emotion without immediately externalizing it as aggression is the definition of toxicity in this context. He doesn't take a breath. He doesn't grieve. He immediately defaults to intimidation. He's mapping coordinates. He's obsessing over heat signatures, using military language for a domestic tragedy. He attacks the nearest, weakest target, the young female teacher.
But isn't that just a tragic failure of imagination on his part more than a moral failure? He's drowning. He's drowning in ambiguity, and he grabs the only tool his culture ever gave him, which is aggression. He is a victim of his own prescribed gender role.
I think it becomes a moral failure the second his actions have consequences. And his rigid belief that he's righteous, that he's the hero of this story, makes him even more dangerous than Paul, the corrupt cop. Because Paul is openly corrupt. The town knows he's a problem. He's a recognizable form of decay. But Archer is acting out of a skewed but fervent sense of duty. He weaponizes his grief under the guise of being the protector, but he becomes the aggressor. He confuses the two. He destroys the world around him because his emotional framework is too rigid to adapt.
I see your point. His internal failure translates directly into external structural violence against an innocent person.
Look at the sheer amount of energy he pours into terrorizing Justine. What if he had put that energy into organizing a real search, into comforting his wife, into just listening to the weird rumors about the old woman on the edge of town? But his ego demanded a concrete win against a concrete enemy, and that demand is what ultimately paralyzes the town's response.
Okay, let's play out that what-if scenario. The sources bring this up. What if Archer, or the town, had listened to the quieter voices? To Justine? To the parents who were urging caution? Could they have saved more children?
The film structure says yes, absolutely. The mob mentality that Archer spearheads is shown to be strategically disastrous. It not only silences the one person, Justine, who might have had a real inkling of the supernatural truth, it diverted all the attention away from Gladys's house.
So had he adapted, had he been willing to show vulnerability instead of aggression?
They might have saved the children sooner. His failure is measured in minutes and lost lives. His inability to adapt is a fatal flaw not just for him, but for the whole community.
That clarifies it perfectly. So the film pairs him with Paul, the cop, to show two sides of the same coin of failed masculinity.
Exactly. Paul is the failure of the institution, the police force that doesn't protect. Archer is the failure of the community, the self-appointed protector who turns on his own. Both men are destructive because they can't adapt to a threat that can't be solved with traditional aggression.
And Archer carries the wreckage of that failure all the way to the final frame. But before we get there, we have to talk about the hardest part of the film to watch. The imagery Cregger uses for the children themselves.
The children running sequence, yes. We need to really slow down and visualize this, because it's where the film moves beyond social commentary and into something far more mythic.
Let's focus on the visuals. The moments when the 17 children run, first from their homes at 2:17 a.m., and then later in the climax when they attack Gladys. The choreography is so specific and so haunting.
It is. Let's describe their body language. They're running, but it's not a normal run. Their arms aren't pumping for speed. They're rigidly, unnaturally outstretched from their bodies, almost like they're being pulled by strings.
And their eyes. Their clothes are dirty, their hair is messy, but it's their eyes. They are wide open, but completely vacant, devoid of consciousness, of fear, of anything. The sources kept saying it's not a posture of escape, it's a posture of agony and surrender.
And this is not just some random directorial choice. This is Cregger making a direct, devastating historical quote. The critics immediately identified this posture as a deliberate replication of the iconic Phan Thi Kim Phuc photograph from the Vietnam War.
The Napalm Girl.
The Napalm Girl. The visual connection is unmistakable.
That is a colossal weight to put on a horror film. By invoking that specific historical image of unimaginable suffering, Cregger is reframing the quiet suburban street of Maybrook as a war zone.
He's saying the children are collateral damage. In Vietnam, they were victims of chemical warfare. In Maybrook, they're victims of Gladys's spell, yes, but also of the town's neglect and paralysis. He's connecting the domestic tragedy of this fictional town to the unending global cycle of violence against the vulnerable.
And that brings us right back to the title, Weapons. This gives it its darkest double meaning.
It does. On one level, the children are literally used as weapons by Gladys to kill her enemies. She turns their innocence into a tool for murder.
But on another level, the film is critiquing how those very images of suffering children are themselves weaponized in our culture.
Right. That phrase, won't somebody think of the children?
Yeah.
It's so often used to manipulate public opinion or to distract from the real structural problems, like the failed Senate vote that leaves that AR-15 hanging over their heads.
The film shows the ultimate consequence. The adults fail to protect the children from actual harm while simultaneously using their suffering as a political prop.
So when you see those vacant-eyed kids, arms outstretched, running to kill, it's the film's most damning indictment of adult failure. They are no longer children. They are symbols of war, forced into a posture of agony.
And the person who forces them into that position is Aunt Gladys. We should spend a moment on her, the villain, as a metaphor. The parasitic witch.
She is not a generic monster. The sources are clear. Her survival depends on draining the essence of the children to maintain her own life force. It's a vampiric relationship that mirrors how, sociologically, older generations are often seen as cannibalizing the futures of the young to maintain an unsustainable status quo.
The boomer critique.
One review explicitly called it that. The old feeding on the life and energy of the new to avoid their own decay.
And the film cleverly links her supernatural addiction to a much more realistic one, through the character of James, the drug addict.
Yes, that's a key connection. Gladys's need for the children's essence is portrayed with the desperation of an addict. James is the realistic version of that decay in the town. Both are symptoms of a place caught in a cycle of dependency.
A cycle that destroys the future.
Whether the town is being drained by a mythological witch or by substance abuse, the cost is always borne by the young. Their vital essence is what feeds the town's self-destructive stasis.
Which leads us to the finale, which is so controversial because it refuses to give the audience any kind of clean, satisfying catharsis. It denies you that relief.
The action itself is horrific. Alex, the surviving teen, has to turn the tables and weaponize the children against Gladys. The victims become the executioners. They tear her apart.
The title pays off in the most brutal way imaginable, but it's the aftermath that's the real gut punch.
It is. The children don't just wake up, healed and ready to go home. They remain vacant. They just stand there over the witch's corpse. Their body language, the look on their faces. It tells you they are fundamentally, irreversibly broken.
The film's message is brutal. You can kill the monster, but you cannot undo the trauma.
The children have been turned into killers. A part of them died in that basement. They are now part of the cycle of violence. The witch is dead, but the structural violence she imprinted on them is now inside them.
And the institutional failure is cemented in that final voiceover. We learn Alex's parents are institutionalized. The family unit is completely destroyed, even after they've won.
It's a profoundly Pyrrhic victory, and it forces you to sit with that uncertainty. What happens to these vacant kids after the credits roll? Cregger refuses to show them recover. They might learn to speak again, but that scar is permanent. They were turned into weapons to survive, and that reality doesn't just go away.
Which brings us back full circle to Archer. That final image of him carrying his vacant son home, it's just a devastating culmination of his entire failed arc.
He got what he thought he wanted. He won. He has the physical body of his son back, but he has utterly lost the boy. All his rage, all his aggression accomplished nothing constructive, and the boy he fought for is now a shell.
The look in Brolin's eyes in that last shot. One critic described it as a realization of the tragedy of the gift he's been given. It's the moment he understands his failure. He's holding the wreckage of his child, and he knows his own actions cost his son his innocence and his community precious time.
So let's put it all together. Weapons is pure social horror. It's arguing with this really clinical precision that societal paralysis is what happens when a culture refuses to acknowledge its own structural wounds.
The violence is layered.
Yeah.
The violence of a Senate vote count, 217. The violence of a community turning on a teacher. The violence of turning children into symbols instead of protecting them.
The absolute genius of the film is in that final thought. The town looked for a witch, a tangible mythological enemy they could defeat, because they couldn't bear to look at the AR-15 floating over their heads.
The mundane, structural violence they refuse to address.
They killed the witch. They got their closure. But the structural violence remains. The storm cloud is still there.
And that leaves us, and you, with the final provocative thought that Cregger wants us to wrestle with.
You have to ask yourself, what is the equivalent storm cloud hanging over your own community right now? What is that omnipresent, normalized threat that everyone is too paralyzed, too isolated, or too busy attacking the wrong target to actually address? That's the real horror. The mythological monster might be gone, but the structural threat is still in the sky.